For 500 years, Rome met its match in the east. Every general who crossed the Euphrates River expecting easy conquest came back humiliated, or didn't come back at all. Marcus Crassus, the richest man in Rome, led 7 legions into the desert and lost them all. Mark Antony suffered one of his most devastating campaigns against Parthian archers he could never quite catch. Emperor after emperor hammered at the same wall and achieved the same result: temporary victories that led nowhere permanent. The Parthians had no great walled cities, no elephant armies, no phalanx formations. Just horse archers who fired backward while galloping away, and heavy cavalry that shattered everything in their path. How did nomads from Central Asia build an empire that held Rome at bay for half a millennium? The region that gives the Parthian Empire its name, Parthia, was not an impressive place at first glance. It occupied the northeastern corner of what is now Iran, a landscape of semi-arid plains, low mountains, and sparse vegetation lying between the more fertile regions of Mesopotamia to the west and the Central Asian steppe to the east and north. It was not a heartland of ancient civilization in the way that Mesopotamia or Egypt was. It had no great river flooding annually to replenish exhausted soil, no naturally defensible position that commanded major trade routes, no accumulated wealth from centuries of agricultural surplus. What it had was a position at the crossroads of worlds, between the settled civilizations of the West and the nomadic cultures of the East, and a people adapted to survive in precisely the kind of marginal landscape that more comfortable civilizations tended to overlook. The founders of the Parthian dynasty were not originally from Parthia at all. The Parni, the tribal group from which the Arsacid dynasty emerged, were part of the Dahe Confederation, a group of nomadic Iranian-speaking peoples who lived on the steppe east of the Caspian Sea. Sometime around 247 BCE, a leader named Arsaces led the Parni across the mountains into Parthia, which at that time was a province of the Seleucid Greek Empire that had inherited much of Alexander the Great's eastern conquests. The Seleucid governor of Parthia was not prepared for the Parni invasion, and Arsaces established himself as ruler of the province. This founding moment established a pattern that would define the Parthian Empire throughout its history: a nomadic people of the steppe establishing themselves as rulers of a settled agricultural civilization, maintaining their nomadic military traditions while gradually adopting the administrative and cultural forms of the civilizations they governed. The Arsacid kings never fully abandoned their steppe identity. They maintained the title King of Kings, the Persian imperial formula, while also presenting themselves on their coins as Philhellenes, lovers of Greek culture. They ruled a world that was Persian in tradition, Greek in formal culture, and nomadic in military practice. The combination was their genius. The Arsacid dynasty that Arsaces founded would rule for over 4.5 centuries, one of the longest-lasting dynasties in ancient history, governing an empire that at its peak extended from the Euphrates River in the west to the borders of India in the east. The dynasty survived external threats from Rome in the west, from Scythians and Kushans in the east, and from persistent internal challenges to royal authority. It outlasted Julius Caesar, Augustus, the Julio-Claudian dynasty, the Flavians, the Antonines, and large portions of the Severan dynasty. The last Arsacid king was still ruling when the Roman Empire was beginning the 3rd century crisis that would nearly destroy it. That kind of institutional endurance does not happen by accident. It happens because a political system, for all its imperfections, contains enough adaptability and enough legitimacy to survive the pressures that destroy less resilient states. The Parthian state that the Arsacids built was unusual in the ancient world because of its genuinely hybrid character. Unlike the Persian Achaemenid Empire that had preceded it, the Parthian state did not attempt to impose a single cultural identity across its vast territory. Unlike the Seleucid Greek Empire it had replaced, it did not use Greek colonization as its primary administrative tool. The Parthian system was a loose confederation of kingdoms, principalities, and city-states, each with substantial internal autonomy, bound together by military obligation and dynastic loyalty to the Arsacid house. It was, in a sense, a federal empire, diverse in its components, unified in its external commitments, and more resilient for its flexibility than a more rigidly centralized state might have been. The political system the Arsacid kings developed was a deliberate response to the challenges of ruling a vast territory with limited central administrative capacity. Rather than trying to impose uniform governance across a diverse empire, the approach that had eventually contributed to both the Persian and Seleucid empires' difficulties, the Parthians worked with existing structures, leaving local elites in place and content, demanding military service and tribute rather than cultural conformity. The first capital of the Parthian kingdom was Nisa, a city in what is now Turkmenistan that served as both an administrative center and a royal necropolis. The archaeological excavations at Nisa have revealed a fascinating picture of early Parthian culture. A hybrid of steppe traditions, Persian ceremonial forms, and Greek artistic influences all present simultaneously in the same palace complex. Ivory rhytons, drinking horns decorated with Greek mythological scenes, were found alongside purely Iranian-style objects. The kings of early Parthia were already multicultural in the most literal sense, living surrounded by objects that spoke different cultural languages simultaneously. Hecatompylos, the city of 100 gates, served as another important early Parthian center, and its very name, Greek for 100 gates, reflects the Greek cultural vocabulary that the Arsacids adopted alongside their Iranian identity. The Parthian kings put Greek inscriptions on their coins alongside Parthian ones. They adopted Greek titles. They maintained Greek as one of the languages of official administration. This was not cultural surrender, it was strategic multilingualism. The Arsacid kings were presenting themselves to different audiences in each audience's preferred language. The great noble families, particularly the Suran and Karen clans, occupied a position in Parthian political life that had no precise equivalent in other ancient monarchies. These families had the recognized right to participate in the selection of kings, to hold the highest military commands, and to govern large territories essentially as autonomous nobles under Arsacid suzerainty. The most powerful Parthian general of the entire Arsacid period, Serena, who destroyed Crassus's army at the Battle of Carrhae, held his command not as a royal appointment, but as the hereditary military prerogative of his noble family. This system had obvious strengths. It kept the great nobles content and loyal by giving them real power. It distributed governance across a vast territory without requiring an enormous centralized bureaucracy, and it allowed the military capacity of noble families to be mobilized quickly in times of crisis. It also had an obvious weakness. When the great nobles were discontented, or when competing Arsacid princes could attract noble support for their own bids for power, the system could become dangerously unstable. The Parthian Empire's greatest vulnerability was the same as its greatest strength: the power of its noble families. The eastward expansion of the Parthian state in the 2nd century BCE, particularly under the great Mithridates I, who ruled from approximately 171 to 138 BCE, transformed the regional power that Arsaces had founded into a genuine empire. By the end of his reign, the Arsacid kingdom controlled most of the former Achaemenid Persian Empire's heartland. A nomadic tribal chieftain's descendants had become rulers of one of the most historically significant regions on Earth. The speed of this transformation, from a provincial chieftainship to a continental empire in less than a century, remains one of the more remarkable political achievements of the ancient world, and one that has not received the attention it deserves outside specialist circles. One of the most striking characteristics of Parthian civilization, and one of the features that most distinguished it from both its predecessor empires and its Roman rival, was its genuine religious pluralism. The Parthian Empire contained Zoroastrians, Jews, Greek polytheists, Babylonian religious communities, early Christians, and numerous local cults, and the Arsacid kings governed all of them with a tolerance that was not merely strategic calculation, but appears to have reflected genuine indifference to theological orthodoxy. Zoroastrianism, the ancient Iranian religion, centered on the cosmic struggle between truth and the lie, between the great god Ahura Mazda and the evil spirit Angra Mainyu, was the dominant religion of the Iranian population of the empire. The sacred fire that symbolized Ahura Mazda's presence burned in temples across the Iranian plateau, maintained by hereditary priestly families whose institutional authority the Arsacid kings generally respected and supported. But Zoroastrianism in the Parthian period was significantly less centralized and doctrinally rigorous than the Sasanian state church that would succeed it. There was no single sacred text, no enforced orthodoxy, no persecution of competing religions. The Jewish communities of Mesopotamia, descendants of the populations deported by the Babylonians in the 6th century BCE, flourished under Parthian rule, in a way that contrasted sharply with their sometimes precarious position under Roman governance. The Jewish communities of Babylonia were large, well-organized, and commercially active, and the Arsacid kings found it both practically wise and personally congenial to leave them in peace. The period of Parthian rule over Mesopotamia corresponds to a period of significant development in Jewish legal and theological scholarship, the groundwork being laid for the Babylonian Talmud that would eventually be compiled in the Sasanian period. Greek religious practices and Greek cultural life survived and even flourished in the cities of Mesopotamia and western Iran throughout the Parthian period. The city of Seleucia on the Tigris, one of the largest cities of the ancient world, with a population estimated at several 100,000, maintained its Greek character for centuries under Parthian rule, its citizens following Greek civic customs, worshipping Greek gods, and conducting much of their public life in the Greek language. The Parthian kings did not attempt to de-Hellenize their western cities, because doing so would have disrupted the commercial and administrative functions those cities performed. The Parthian approach to religion reflects the broader Parthian approach to governance, prioritized stability and function over ideological conformity. A religious community that worshipped its own gods, maintained its own legal customs, organized its own internal affairs, and paid its taxes and provided its military obligations, was a community that the Arsacid state had no reason to disturb. The cost of enforced conformity, resentment, resistance, disruption of productive communities, was simply not worth paying when the alternative was peaceful coexistence. This tolerance had a practical dimension that shaped the empire's cultural character profoundly. Ideas and practices moved freely across the Parthian Empire's religious landscape. Zoroastrian concepts influenced Jewish theology. Greek philosophical ideas interacted with Iranian cosmological thinking. The early Christian communities that appeared in Mesopotamia in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE found a relatively hospitable environment under Parthian rule, significantly less threatening than the intermittent Roman persecutions of the same period. The Parthian Empire was, in this respect, a more open civilization than its Roman rival, whatever the Romans might have claimed about their own tolerance. The diversity of the Parthian religious world was not just a passive fact of geography. It was actively maintained by an imperial policy that recognized practical wisdom in not disturbing communities that were peaceful, productive, and paying their taxes. The Arsacid kings presented themselves differently to different audiences. As protectors of Zoroastrian sacred fires to Iranian subjects, as Philhellenes to Greek city populations, as benevolent overlords to Jewish communities who retained their own legal and religious autonomy. This was not inconsistency. It was the sophisticated self-presentation of rulers who understood that a vast, diverse empire required different kinds of legitimacy in different places. The Roman Empire often struggled with exactly this challenge. The Parthians solved it, imperfectly but effectively, through genuine pluralism rather than enforced conformity. The Parthian Empire left physical traces that are less dramatic than the great monuments of Egypt or Rome, but that reflect, in their own way, the specific priorities and capacities of a civilization that valued function over display and adaptability over standardization. Parthian architecture was not monumental in the Roman sense, not designed to overawe with sheer scale, but it was technically accomplished, and it introduced or perfected forms that would shape Islamic architecture for the next 1,000 years. The Iwan, a vaulted hall open on one side, typically serving as a grand entrance or reception space, is the most characteristic element of Parthian architecture and one of the most significant architectural contributions of the ancient Iranian world. The Iwan solved a specific climatic problem. In the hot, dry summers of Iran and Mesopotamia, a building that was open on one side, while enclosed and shaded on the other, could catch prevailing breezes while protecting its occupants from direct sun. The result was a space that was simultaneously protected and open, interior and exterior, private and accessible, qualities that made it ideal for the formal reception functions that were central to Parthian court culture. The technical achievement underlying the Iwan was mastery of the barrel vault, a continuous arched ceiling that could span wide spaces without intermediate columns. Parthian builders, working in a landscape with almost no available stone, became expert in constructing barrel vaults from baked brick, developing techniques for managing the lateral thrust that vaulted construction generates. The Arch of Ctesiphon, the surviving remnant of the great Sasanian palace built on the foundations of the Parthian capital, is the largest single-span brick vault in the ancient world, and it stands as testament to the building traditions that the Sasanians inherited from the Parthians who came before them. The Qanat system, a technology for bringing water to agriculture in arid regions through gently sloping underground tunnels that tap into aquifers in the foothills and bring water by gravity to the fields below, was an Iranian invention predating the Parthians, but perfected and expanded under Arsacid rule. A Qanat could carry water for tens of kilometers underground, losing almost none to evaporation in the process. A critical advantage in a climate where surface canals would lose enormous quantities of water before it reached the fields it was meant to irrigate. The Parthian road network connected the empire's major cities and military installations, facilitating both commerce and rapid military deployment. Unlike the Roman road system, which prioritized straight lines and permanent paved construction, the Parthian network was more adaptive, using the most practical routes across a varied landscape rather than forcing geometric precision onto difficult terrain. Way stations at regular intervals provided rest and resupply for official travelers, military units, and merchants. The Silk Road, the network of trade routes connecting China with the Mediterranean, passed through Parthian territory, and maintaining the infrastructure that kept it functioning was both a commercial interest and a political responsibility for the Arsacid state. The city of Hatra, in the Mesopotamian desert of what is now northern Iraq, is one of the best preserved examples of Parthian urban architecture. Its massive circular defensive walls, unique in the ancient world, enclosed a city of temples and palaces that combined Greek, Iranian, and Mesopotamian architectural elements in a way that perfectly reflects the Parthian cultural synthesis. Hatra held off Roman sieges under both Trajan and Septimius Severus, its desert location and formidable walls proving too much for Roman siege engineering on both occasions. The geographic position of the Parthian Empire was, from a commercial perspective, one of the most advantageous in the ancient world. Lying between the Roman Empire to the west and the Han dynasty of China to the east, the Parthians sat astride the most valuable trade route in the ancient world, the route that would later be called the Silk Road. And they controlled it with the thoroughness that their military and administrative capabilities allowed. The trade that moved along this route was staggering in its volume and diversity. Silk from China, a luxury so valued in Rome that the Roman Senate at various points tried to ban its use, worrying about the gold flowing east to pay for it, was the most famous commodity, but far from the only one. Spices from India and Southeast Asia, precious stones from Central Asia, fine glassware from the Syrian cities moving east, cotton textiles from India moving west, horses, the distinctive heavy horses of the Fergana Valley in Central Asia, which both the Chinese and the Parthians valued as war animals superior to steppe ponies, moving in both directions depending on political conditions. The Parthians did not merely allow this trade to pass through their territory and collect tolls on it, though they certainly did that. They actively participated in it as merchants and as the guarantors of the security that long-distance trade required. Parthian merchants operated across the entire length of the route, carrying goods, providing financing, managing the complexities of exchange between parties who spoke different languages and used different currencies. The commercial infrastructure of the Arsacid Empire, its road network, its way stations, its system of weights and measures, its legal frameworks for commercial contracts, made the Silk Road function as a reliable commercial system, rather than merely a series of opportunistic exchanges. The tension between Parthia and Rome over control of the Silk Road trade was one of the persistent sources of conflict between the two empires. Rome desperately wanted direct access to the eastern trade, cutting out the Parthian middlemen who captured a significant share of the value of every transaction. Repeated Roman military campaigns in Mesopotamia were driven, at least partly, by the desire to control the commercial crossroads that the Parthians occupied. The Parthians, equally rational in their commercial interests, resisted every Roman attempt to establish permanent presence east of the Euphrates. The Parthian currency, silver drachmas, bearing the image of the ruling king in the Greek style, was one of the most widely circulated currencies in the ancient world east of Rome. The fact that Parthian coins used Greek legends and Greek artistic conventions reflects the sophistication of Parthian commercial thinking. The Greek monetary system was the established commercial standard across Alexander's former territories, and maintaining compatibility with it was simply good business. Parthian coins have been found across a vast area, from Roman Syria to Afghanistan to India, tracing the reach of Arsacid commercial activity. The first recorded official diplomatic contact between the Roman and Chinese empires was mediated by the Parthians. Around 97 CE, the Chinese Han dynasty sent a diplomatic mission toward Rome. The Parthian officials who encountered this mission reportedly discouraged it from proceeding. They preferred to manage the trade route themselves rather than allow direct contact between their two powerful neighbors that might eventually cut them out of the equation entirely. Whether this story is entirely accurate or somewhat embellished in the retelling, it perfectly captures the Parthian understanding of their strategic commercial position. They were the indispensable intermediary, and they intended to stay that way. The transformation of the Arsacid kingdom from a regional power in northeastern Iran into a genuine empire controlling the heartland of the ancient Near East was the work primarily of one man, Mithridates I, who ruled from approximately 171 to 138 BCE, and whose ambition and military capability fundamentally changed what the Arsacid dynasty was and what it could aspire to become. Mithridates I inherited a kingdom that was already secure in its Iranian territories, but had not yet challenged the dominant power of the region, the Seleucid Greek Empire, which still controlled Mesopotamia and the western Iranian plateau. The Seleucids were weakening, battered by Roman pressure from the west and by the same centrifugal forces that had already cost them their eastern territories to Bactrian Greek rebels and to the Arsacids themselves. Mithridates recognized the opportunity and moved to seize it with a decisiveness that established his reputation as one of the great military leaders of the ancient world. His western campaigns consumed most of his reign. Media fell first, giving the Arsacids control of the central Iranian plateau. Then Persis, the heartland of the old Persian Achaemenid Empire, with its symbolic resonance for Iranian identity. Then the great prize, Mesopotamia itself, including Babylon, with all of its historical and religious significance, and Seleucia on the Tigris, the largest and wealthiest city in the east. By the end of his reign, Mithridates I had transformed the Arsacid kingdom into an empire that could legitimately present itself as the successor of the Persian Achaemenid dynasty. The restoration of Iranian imperial power after nearly 2 centuries of Greek Seleucid rule. The political and cultural implications of this expansion were enormous. Mithridates I was no longer the king of a relatively modest Iranian kingdom. He was now the ruler of Babylon, one of the most symbolically important cities in the world, with associations going back to the Sumerian and Akkadian civilizations of 3,000 years earlier. He was the ruler of territories where the Jewish Babylonian exile had taken place. He was the ruler of Greek cities that had maintained Hellenic culture for over a century since Alexander's conquests. The adoption of the title King of Kings, the Achaemenid Persian imperial formula, by Mithridates I was a deliberate act of political symbolism, presenting the Arsacid victory as the restoration of legitimate Persian-Iranian rule over territories that had been under foreign Greek domination since Alexander. This narrative served multiple purposes. It gave Parthian rule legitimacy in the eyes of Iranian populations who remembered Persian greatness. It positioned the Arsacids as defenders of the Iranian tradition against Greek outsiders, and it established a framework for how subsequent Arsacid kings would understand and present their own authority. Every king who came after Mithridates I built on the foundation he had laid, both territorial and ideological. He was the empire's true founder in every meaningful sense, even though the Arsacid dynasty had existed for over a century before him. The Parthian military system was unlike anything Rome had faced before, and the Roman military's repeated difficulty in adapting to it reflects just how fundamentally different Parthian warfare was from the forms of combat that Roman training and doctrine had been developed to handle. The Parthian army had 2 primary components: heavy armored cavalry called cataphracts and light horse archers, that were designed to work together in a way that created tactical problems with no straightforward solution. The cataphract was an armored horseman carrying a heavy lance, with both horse and rider covered in overlapping metal scale armor. The cataphract charge was a devastating shock weapon, a wall of armored men and horses moving at full gallop, their weight and momentum sufficient to break most infantry formations that tried to stand against them. Against a Roman legion equipped with pilum and gladius and trained to fight at close range on foot, a cataphract charge presented a genuine existential threat. The armour that covered the cataphracts made them resistant to the pilum throw that was the Roman legionaries' primary response to cavalry, and their momentum at the charge was almost impossible to stop once it was committed. But the cataphracts had a vulnerability. They were slow, expensive to maintain, and difficult to maneuver once committed. They could be effective against infantry that held its ground, but if the infantry broke and ran, the cataphracts could not pursue effectively. And if the cataphracts themselves were forced to retreat, their armour became a liability rather than an asset. This is where the horse archer completed the tactical picture. Parthian horse archers rode light horses without armour, carrying the composite recurve bow that the Scythians had pioneered and the steppe peoples had refined over centuries. They could not stand against infantry in close combat. They were not designed to. What they could do was shower an enemy formation with arrows from beyond effective infantry response range, moving constantly to stay out of reach, never engaging at close quarters unless the enemy formation had been so disrupted by arrow fire that close combat was no longer dangerous. The tactical combination was elegant and difficult to counter. If an enemy infantry formation advanced toward the horse archers, the archers retreated while continuing to fire, what became known as the Parthian shot, the maneuver of firing backward over the horse's hindquarters while appearing to flee. If the infantry stayed in formation and did not advance, the archers continued to pour arrows into it until it was too disrupted to hold together. If the formation did break, the cataphracts could be sent in to exploit the disorder and complete the destruction. Roman doctrine was designed for a different kind of war, close-quarters infantry combat against disciplined opponents who would stand and fight. Against enemies who refused to stand and fight, who could be everywhere and nowhere simultaneously, who could inflict casualties while remaining invulnerable to the Roman legionaries' primary weapons, the Roman system had no reliable answer. The Roman military spent over 3 centuries trying to develop one, and never fully succeeded. The Parthian shot has entered the English language as a metaphor for a final cutting remark made while departing a confrontation, a last attack delivered while appearing to retreat. That the phrase has survived suggests how deeply the Parthian tactical innovation impressed itself on the cultural memory of the ancient world. At the height of Arsacid power, the Parthian Empire was the second largest and second most powerful state in the known world, a position it held, with some fluctuation, for most of the final century BCE and the 1st century CE. The boundary between the Parthian and Roman empires along the Euphrates River was not just a political frontier. It was one of the most significant dividing lines in ancient history. The boundary between 2 different models of civilization that met, competed, fought, and ultimately influenced each other in ways that shaped the development of both. The culture of the Arsacid Empire at its peak was a genuine synthesis, not a mere surface coating of Greek over Iranian, but a deep intermingling of traditions that produced something neither purely Greek nor purely Iranian. The Parthian king sat on his throne wearing Iranian royal dress, received visitors according to Iranian court ceremonial, worshipped Iranian gods, and simultaneously put Greek inscriptions on his coins, maintained Greek cities in his western territories, patronized Greek theatre and Greek philosophy, and called himself Phil-Hellene. This was not confusion or inconsistency. It was the deliberate self-presentation of a ruler who governed multiple cultural communities and understood the importance of speaking each community's cultural language. The physical capital of the empire at its height, Ctesiphon, on the Tigris River across from the older Greek city of Seleucia, embodied this synthesis architecturally. The palace complex at Ctesiphon used Iranian architectural forms, the Great Iwan, the formal axial layout, the emphasis on enclosed royal space. but decorated with both Iranian and Hellenistic artistic programs. The city across the river, Seleucia, maintained its Greek character, while the new Parthian capital rose beside it. The two cities together formed what was effectively the largest urban complex in the ancient world outside of Rome itself. Parthian art of this period shows the same synthesis in visual form. The famous Parthian style, with its frontal presentation of figures, its emphasis on formal symmetry, its combination of Iranian and Hellenistic motifs, represents a genuine artistic innovation, not simply a provincial version of either Iranian or Greek art, but something new that emerged from their interaction. This frontal presentation style would prove enormously influential. It passed through the art of the Palmyrene kingdom, the Kushan Empire, and early Christian art into the Byzantine tradition, where it became the standard mode of representing sacred figures. The commercial vitality of the empire at this period is reflected in the archaeological record of its cities. Fine pottery, glass, textiles, and metalwork from across the ancient world have been found at Parthian sites, evidence of a consumer culture that had access to goods from India, China, Egypt, and the Roman world. The Parthian elite consumed luxury goods from everywhere and produced luxury goods that their neighbors valued. The economic interconnection of the ancient world in the 1st century BCE and CE ran through Parthian territory and was organized substantially by Parthian commercial infrastructure. The Parthian Empire, over its nearly 5 centuries of existence, produced a remarkable range of leaders, kings of great vision and military commanders of extraordinary skill, as well as kings whose incompetence or fratricidal destructiveness nearly brought the whole edifice down. 3 figures stand out as particularly significant in shaping what the empire was and what it achieved. Mithridates II, who ruled from approximately 123 to 88 BCE and is called the Great in modern scholarship, was the Arsacid king who consolidated what Mithridates I had won and transformed the empire into a mature state with the diplomatic relationships and institutional structures of a genuine great power. He pushed the empire's eastern frontier to the Indus River Valley, securing control of the Central Asian trade routes that were central to Parthian commercial power. He established the first formal diplomatic relations between Parthia and Rome, sending an embassy that met with the Roman general Sulla in 96 BCE, the first known official contact between the two powers. He adopted the title King of Kings with a seriousness that went beyond symbolic claim, establishing the institutional reality to match it. Under Mithridates II, Parthia was recognized by its neighbors, including a reluctant Rome, as the dominant power in the ancient Near East. Surena was not a king, but a noble commander, the hereditary general of the Suren family, who achieved the most dramatic military victory of the Arsacid period, with resources that were a fraction of what he faced. At the Battle of Carrhae in 53 BCE, Surena commanded approximately 10,000 cavalry, horse archers and cataphracts in their characteristic combination, against 7 Roman legions under Marcus Crassus. He was around 30 years old. The Roman force numbered over 35,000. Surena destroyed it almost completely, killing Crassus and most of his army in one of the worst defeats in Roman military history. He did it through the patient application of the Parthian tactical system, using his horse archers to exhaust and fragment the Roman formation, then committing his cataphracts to finish what the arrows had started. The tragedy of Surena's story is that his very success destroyed him. His fame after Carrhae was so great that King Orodes II, who had not even participated in the campaign, became afraid of him and had him executed. The king, who had won the empire's greatest military victory, was murdered by the king he had served for the crime of being too successful. It is one of the more telling examples of how the Parthian system's reliance on noble families and the resulting tension between royal authority and noble power could undermine its own greatest achievements. Orodes II, who ordered Serena's execution, was himself a complex figure. He was the Arsacid king who presided over Carrhae and who, according to an ancient story that may be legendary but captures something true about the relationship between the two civilizations, was watching a Greek theatrical performance when the head of Crassus was brought to him. The story goes that the actor playing Agave in Euripides' Bacchae, carrying the head of Pentheus as a prop, paused his performance as the real head of Crassus was placed on the stage. Whether or not this specific story is historical, it encapsulates the Parthian reality. A court that was simultaneously Iranian in political form, Greek in cultural consumption, and militarily capable of humiliating the greatest power in the Western world. The story of the Battle of Carrhae begins not with the battle itself, but with the man who made it inevitable. Marcus Licinius Crassus was the wealthiest man in Rome, the financier who had, with Julius Caesar and Pompey, formed the first triumvirate that effectively controlled Roman politics. He had used his wealth to finance Caesar's political career, to purchase military commands, and to position himself as a political player of the first rank. What he had not done was win a significant military victory, and in a culture where military glory was the ultimate currency of political status, his wealth and his political connections could not fully compensate for this gap. In 55 BCE, Crassus obtained the governorship of Syria with the explicit intention of using it as a springboard for an eastern campaign against Parthia. His advisors counseled caution. The Parthians were an unknown quantity, the terrain was unfamiliar, the military situation was complicated. Crassus ignored all of this. He had 7 legions, approximately 35,000 Roman soldiers at their most efficient, and the confidence of a man who had never faced anything he could not overcome with enough money or enough political leverage. The Parthian response to the Roman invasion was managed by Serena, who understood from the beginning that Crassus's weakness was his ignorance of the environment and his army's fundamental tactical unsuitability for fighting mobile cavalry in open desert terrain. Serena led the Roman army southward, away from the more hospitable river valleys where Roman logistics could function, into increasingly arid territory where the Roman supply chain was stretched to its limits, and the men were already suffering from heat and thirst before the fighting began. At Carrhae, the Roman army found itself surrounded by Parthian horse archers in open terrain with no cover, no water, no possibility of advancing, and no safe direction of retreat. The horse archers circled the Roman formations continuously, showering them with arrows from beyond effective pilum range. When the Romans formed the testudo, the famous tortoise formation, with shields overlapping on all sides, they could reduce casualties but could not advance, and the Parthian archers had an effectively unlimited supply of arrows, being resupplied by camel train. The Romans were being killed by men they could not reach, in terrain they could not use, in a battle they had been brought to fight on Parthian terms. Crassus's son, Publius, led a cavalry charge to try to drive off the archers, and the archers retreated, drawing the Roman cavalry away from the main body, then turned and destroyed it completely. The severed head of Publius was brought back and thrown at his father's feet as the battle continued. Crassus, reportedly, said nothing and continued trying to manage a deteriorating situation that was beyond management. The aftermath was catastrophic. Crassus himself died during a supposed negotiation meeting, killed, according to ancient sources, when the meeting turned violent. Of the 7 legions, approximately 20,000 men were killed and 10,000 were taken prisoner. The Parthians reportedly melted gold and poured it into Crassus's dead mouth, a comment on his legendary greed that may be legend, but has stuck in the historical memory ever since. The Roman standards taken at Carrhae, the sacred eagles that represented legionary honor and identity, became a symbol of Roman humiliation that would not be recovered for over 30 years until Augustus secured their return through diplomacy in 20 BCE. Carrhae reshaped Roman strategic thinking about the East in ways that persisted for the rest of the empire's history. The Euphrates River became, implicitly, a recognized boundary, not formally acknowledged as such by either side, but treated in practice as the limit of safe Roman military operations. Campaigns east of the Euphrates were attempted by Julius Caesar, planned but never executed; Mark Antony, attempted and failed; Trajan, temporarily successful but not permanently held; and Septimius Severus, partially successful. But none produced the decisive Roman victory that every emperor who tried sought. The ghost of Carrhae haunted Roman Eastern strategy for centuries. The Parthian royal court was one of the most dangerous places in the ancient world for everyone who inhabited it, including the king. The combination of a monarchical system without clear succession rules, a powerful nobility with the right to participate in selecting kings, and multiple royal sons with the backing of different noble factions, created conditions for political violence that were endemic rather than exceptional. Almost no Arsacid king died peacefully in his bed. Assassination, blinding, and exile were the normal instruments of political transition. The absence of a fixed succession system, the eldest son did not automatically inherit, meant that every change of reign was potentially contested. A king who had multiple sons from different mothers, each with noble family support behind them, was creating the conditions for civil war when he died. The great noble families, particularly the Suran and Karen clans, played king-making roles, backing the candidate whose accession would most benefit their own interests. This gave the nobility enormous leverage over the monarchy, but also created the constant possibility that a discontented faction could simply support a different royal pretender and trigger a succession crisis. The Roman Empire's strategic approach to Parthia exploited this vulnerability systematically. Roman diplomats cultivated relationships with Arsacid princes in exile, offering them political support and sometimes military assistance in exchange for political concessions. The return of Phraates IV's sons to Rome as diplomatic hostages, arranged to protect them from fratricidal court politics as much as for diplomatic reasons, gave Rome a collection of potential Arsacid claimants who could be deployed against a hostile Parthian king at convenient moments. The Romans never fully weaponized this capability, but the threat was always present. The Parthian intelligence system was organized around commercial networks in a way that suited the empire's structure. Merchants traveling the Silk Road through Parthian territory were natural intelligence sources. They observed military movements, assessed economic conditions, reported political rumors from the courts they visited. The caravansaries and way stations along the major trade routes were nodes in an information network as much as commercial infrastructure. The Arsacid court received a regular flow of intelligence about Roman military dispositions along the Euphrates, about conditions in the eastern provinces of the Roman Empire, and about the political situation in the kingdoms along the borders. The use of eunuchs as court officials, a practice the Parthians shared with many other ancient Near Eastern courts, created a class of palace officials whose survival depended entirely on royal favor, and who therefore had strong incentives to provide the king with accurate information rather than flattery. Eunuch court officials often served as channels through which information about potential conspiracies reached the king, though they also sometimes participated in those conspiracies themselves when they judged it advantageous. The harem politics of the Arsacid court, the competition among queens and royal concubines for influence over succession, added another layer of complexity to an already complicated political environment. A queen whose son was well positioned for succession had strong incentives to eliminate rivals, and the tools of court politics, poison, manipulation of the king's favor, alliance with powerful noble families, were available to her. Several of the most dramatic succession crises in Parthian history appear to have had their origins in harem politics as much as in noble faction competition. The 2nd century CE, which had seen the Parthian Empire survive Roman invasions under Trajan and reach a kind of stable equilibrium with Rome, ended with a catastrophe that neither empire had anticipated or could effectively counter. The Antonine Plague, a pandemic that swept through the Roman Empire beginning around 165 CE and continuing for decades, reached the Parthian Empire through the same trade networks that had made both empires prosperous. The long-distance commercial connections that were the foundation of Silk Road prosperity became vectors for biological catastrophe. The Antonine Plague is now generally believed to have been smallpox, a disease that appears to have been introduced to both the Roman and Parthian populations, which had no prior immunity, from an eastern reservoir, possibly through the Indian Ocean trade network. The Roman sources record devastating mortality. Some estimates suggest the plague killed 5 million people in the Roman Empire during its peak years. The Parthian sources are less abundant, but the plague clearly affected the Parthian population with similar severity. The political consequences of epidemic mortality were severe and long-lasting. Loss of population reduced agricultural production, military manpower, and tax revenues simultaneously. Provincial governors who had previously maintained stability through reliable systems of governance found those systems disrupted by the deaths of administrators, tax collectors, and military officers. Regions that had been firmly within the imperial system began to assert greater autonomy as central authority weakened. The climate of Central Asia appears to have been shifting during this period in ways that put pressure on the pastoral economies of the steppe peoples along Parthia's eastern borders. Periods of drought reduced the carrying capacity of the steppe, pushing pastoral peoples toward the settled agricultural regions to the south and west. The Arsacid eastern frontier, always the less well-defended because Roman pressure from the west absorbed more military resources, came under increasing pressure from Kushan and other Central Asian groups. The Roman invasions of Mesopotamia under Trajan in 115 to 117 CE and under Septimius Severus in 197 to 198 CE, while not permanently successful, caused enormous damage to Parthian infrastructure and population in the most economically productive regions of the empire. The repeated sacking of Ctesiphon, seized by Roman forces at least 4 times over the empire's history, was not just a political humiliation, but an economic disruption affecting the commercial center of the Arsacid world. The succession crises that had always been a feature of Arsacid politics became more frequent and more damaging in the late 2nd and early 3rd centuries CE. Periods of dual kingship, 2 claimants both exercising royal authority in different parts of the empire, were particularly destructive as they invited both Roman intervention and provincial separatism. The great noble families, sensing weakening central authority, began to exercise their traditional autonomy more aggressively, making coordinated responses to external threats increasingly difficult to organize. The final decades of the Arsacid dynasty were a period of civil war, Roman invasion, and provincial fragmentation that progressively stripped the empire of the coherence and military capacity that had made it formidable. The combination of external pressure and internal division that had brought other ancient empires down was working on Parthia with cumulative force. The civil war between Vologases VI and Artabanus IV, 2 Arsacid princes claiming the throne simultaneously, each with noble family support, was the decisive internal crisis. For nearly 2 decades, the empire was effectively divided, with different regions recognizing different kings and the military resources of the state being consumed in internal conflict rather than being available for external defense. The Roman Empire, which had its own internal difficulties during this period, was nonetheless able to exploit Parthian weakness through periodic raids rather than sustained campaigns. The provincial nobility, which had always had substantial autonomy under the Arsacid system, took advantage of the succession crisis to extend that autonomy further. The semi-independent kingdoms and principalities that had always existed within the Parthian federated structure, Elymaeus, Characene, the Osrene, became less responsive to central authority and more focused on their own interests. The empire that had functioned as a coherent entity for over 4 centuries was beginning to unravel at its edges. Trade disruption made the financial situation worse. The Silk Road commerce that had provided a significant portion of Parthian imperial income required the security that stable Parthian control of the route had provided. As internal conflict weakened that control, merchants began to seek alternative routes or to reduce their trading activity. Tax revenues declined as commercial activity declined. Military capacity declined as tax revenues declined. The spiral was self-reinforcing and accelerating. The city of Ctesiphon, captured and sacked by Septimius Severus in 197 to 198 CE, never fully recovered its pre-invasion prosperity. The population losses from the Antonine Plague, compounded by the violence and displacement of repeated Roman campaigns, left the capital and its surrounding region economically diminished. The Arsacid kings, who ruled from a damaged Ctesiphon in the early 3rd century CE, were governing a significantly poorer empire than their predecessors had commanded. The gap between what the empire had been and what it now was had become impossible to ignore, and impossible to close through any means available to the last Arsacid kings. The end of the Arsacid dynasty came not from Rome, the eternal enemy that had fought the empire for 3 centuries without destroying it, but from within Iran itself. In the province of Persis, the Persian heartland, the region that had given the Achaemenid Persian Empire its name and character, a family called the Sasanians had been accumulating local power for generations. Their ancestor Sasan had been a priest at a major Zoroastrian fire temple. His son Papak had become the regional ruler of Persis, and Papak's son Ardashir would transform provincial authority into imperial ambition. Ardashir's rise follows a trajectory that echoes the Arsacid story almost exactly: a provincial power at the margins of imperial attention, building strength gradually until it was strong enough to challenge the center. The difference was that Ardashir was an Iranian from the Persian heartland, drawing on the same Achaemenid Persian tradition of imperial legitimacy that the Arsacids had always invoked, but had perhaps never fully embodied. His message, implicit in his actions and explicit in his propaganda, was that he was restoring authentic Persian rule, not continuing the hybrid nomadic Iranian-Greek compromise that the Arsacids had represented. The military campaigns through which Ardashir established his dominance over surrounding regions in Persis and Fars began around 205 to 210 CE, while the Arsacid civil war between Vologases VI and Artabanus IV was consuming the empire's military resources and political attention. By the time the Arsacid court focused seriously on the Sasanian threat, Ardashir had already built a formidable military force and a territorial base that could sustain further expansion. The decisive confrontation came at the Battle of Hormozdgan in April 224 CE. Artabanus IV, who had by this point established himself as the dominant Arsacid claimant, led a Parthian army against Ardashir's forces. The battle was decisive and fatal. Artabanus was killed in the fighting. His death ended the Arsacid dynasty's practical ability to resist the Sasanian takeover. Resistance continued for a few years in various provinces, but without the royal dynasty's organizing authority, it was fragmented and ultimately ineffective. The transition from Arsacid to Sasanian rule was, in some respects, less dramatic than the political narrative suggests. Many of the great noble families that had supported the Arsacids transferred their allegiance to the Sasanians. The administrative structures of the empire, the provincial governance, the commercial infrastructure, the military organization, continued with personnel changes at the top rather than wholesale institutional replacement. The cities of Mesopotamia passed from one Iranian dynasty to another with less disruption than the political change implied. What changed fundamentally was the ideological character of the new empire. The Sasanians were committed to a version of Iranian imperial identity that was more explicitly religious, more deeply rooted in Zoroastrian orthodoxy, and less accommodating of the Hellenistic cultural legacy that the Arsacids had maintained. The long Parthian synthesis of Iranian and Greek cultural forms was succeeded by a more exclusively Iranian imperial identity. The age of the Philhellene kings of Parthia was over. The Parthian Empire has a strange position in historical memory. For Roman citizens of the 1st century BCE and CE, it was the most significant geopolitical reality in the world east of the Euphrates. The power that humiliated Crassus, checked Mark Antony, resisted Trajan, and defined the eastern limit of Roman expansion for centuries. For later European historians, shaped by Roman sources that naturally emphasized Roman perspective, Parthia became a supporting character in the Roman story, rather than a civilization worth understanding in its own terms. This distortion has gradually been corrected as archaeological work in Iran, Iraq, and Central Asia has produced direct evidence of Parthian civilization that supplements and sometimes contradicts the Roman literary record. The excavations at Nisa, at Hatra, at Dura Europus on the Euphrates frontier, and at numerous other sites have given us a picture of Parthian material culture, religious life, and artistic achievement that was simply unavailable to earlier generations of historians. The architectural legacy of the Parthians is their most visible physical contribution to subsequent civilizations. The Iwan, the great vaulted hall open on one side, became the dominant form of monumental architecture across the Islamic world, from Spain to India. The mosques, palaces, and caravanserais of Islamic civilization from the 7th century CE onward used the Iwan as their primary formal element, carrying forward a building tradition that had developed in Parthian Iran over the preceding centuries. When you look at the great mosque courtyards of Isfahan, or the Mughal palace complexes of India, you are looking at the distant architectural descendants of the Parthian building tradition. The Parthian military legacy was equally significant. The cataphract, heavy armoured cavalry with both horse and rider protected, became the dominant cavalry type across the ancient world in the centuries following Parthia's peak. The Roman army eventually developed its own cataphract units in response to Parthian success with them. Byzantine heavy cavalry, Sassanid heavy cavalry, and eventually medieval European knightly cavalry all trace their lineage back to the cataphract tradition that the Parthians perfected and their successors inherited. The Silk Road commercial system that the Parthians managed and maintained for centuries was one of the most significant commercial networks in world history. The long-distance trade connections that it sustained, linking the silk-producing workshops of Han Dynasty China with the luxury-consuming cities of the Roman Empire, created the first genuinely global economy in the sense of sustained, organized, profit-motivated commerce across the full width of the Eurasian landmass. The Parthians did not create the Silk Road alone, but their territorial position and commercial infrastructure was central to its functioning during its most productive centuries. The term Parthian shot, a parting blow delivered while departing, or a final cutting remark made on leaving, has survived in the English language as a memorial to the most celebrated Parthian tactical innovation. It is a curious kind of immortality, a linguistic trace of a military practice that made Rome bleed, preserved in the everyday speech of cultures that mostly have no idea where the phrase comes from. The Parthians shot their arrows backward while riding away from Rome, and the echo of that maneuver is still audible, faintly, in how English speakers talk about arguments and departures. The Parthian Empire held Rome at bay for nearly 5 centuries. It preserved and transmitted Iranian cultural traditions through an era of Greek cultural dominance. It managed one of the most important commercial networks in the ancient world. It pioneered architectural and military forms that shaped subsequent civilizations across Asia and Europe. And it did all of this as a genuinely plural civilization, tolerant of religious diversity, accommodating of cultural difference, governing through a federal system that left local communities with substantial autonomy. The eagle of Rome met the bow of Parthia for 500 years across the Euphrates, and neither won decisively. That outcome, that persistent, unresolved contest between two great powers, shaped the ancient world as much as any conquest. The world we inherited was partly made by what did not happen, by the Roman Empire that could never quite extend itself east of the Euphrates, and by the Parthian Empire that held the line. What is perhaps most remarkable about the Parthian story is how little it is known by the general public relative to its actual importance. Every educated person knows about Rome. Most know something about Persia and Greece. But Parthia, which maintained the single most important geopolitical boundary in the ancient world for half a millennium, which managed the commercial network that connected the Roman and Chinese civilizations, which preserved Iranian cultural identity through 2 centuries of Greek cultural dominance, remains largely invisible in the popular imagination of the ancient world. Part of the reason is the nature of our sources. The Parthians left almost no literary legacy of their own. Their history is told almost entirely through Roman sources that naturally saw them as enemies, and through archaeological evidence that has been excavated only partially, and often under difficult conditions, in modern Iran and Iraq. The Romans wrote extensively about Carrhae because it was a Roman humiliation worth explaining and contextualizing. They wrote about Ctesiphon because Roman armies occasionally captured it. But they had no interest in explaining how Parthian civilization actually worked from the inside, or in giving the empire they faced the kind of sympathetic understanding that might have complicated the Roman narrative of Eastern barbarism confronting Western civilization. The archaeological recovery of Parthian civilization is ongoing, and every decade produces new finds that complicate and enrich the picture. The Parthians are not entirely lost. They live in the architecture of 1,000 mosques, in the DNA of populations across Iran and Central Asia, in the linguistic traces of Parthian loanwords that entered other languages during the centuries of Arsacid commercial dominance, and in the military tradition of armoured cavalry that shaped warfare across Eurasia for over 1,000 years after the last Arsacid king fell at Hormozgan. The empire that held Rome at bay for 5 centuries deserves to be remembered with the respect that kind of achievement demands.